sex education of the past failed us. Because birds and bees, they don't fuck. Welcome to Birds and Bees Don't Fuck, a podcast where we learn exactly how bad our formative sex education, or lack thereof, really was. I'm your host, Ariel Zadok. I'm a producer, sex educator, and intimacy coordinator. My guest today is not Ruby, though she's trying to make it so. My guest today is an orgasm and neuro pleasure coach. Welcome to the show, Wendy Perkins.
Hello.
Yay! I literally just said that Ruby's probably going to jump up here, and she did not waste any time.
Nope. She's like, I want to get in on the action.
Get out of here, cat. Well, a pussy to start the show. Get out of here. Welcome. Hi. I'm so excited to have you on here. We just met what was that, 2 weeks ago?
Yeah,
Something
a few weeks
like
ago.
that. Yeah. And immediately it was like, please come on my show. So let's just start by telling me what an orgasm and neuro pleasure coach is.
All right. So self-coined title. When I started out in this whole world of sex education, but I wasn't sure what I was doing, my focus really was on orgasms. And it was because I wanted to have my own better ones. Honestly, that was the reason I got into this. And as I started developing, skills, frameworks, practices for people to follow along with and learn, the better things, I started realizing how much it was more about helping people learn how to regulate their nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
And one day, one of my clients was like, "You're basically like a neuro pleasure coach." And I was like, I'm using that. And so that's kind of where I come from, because just even understanding how orgasms work, they all start and end in the nervous system. So, there is the nervous system component to it. And pleasure really is the quickest pathway to making changes and improvements in your life.
Yeah. And it's so our nervous systems are so dysregulated, especially after the last 3-4 years of trauma and COVID and all this stuff. So there's so much more that we have to work through now that maybe we didn't necessarily have to 4 years ago, because we just didn't have the same experiences and all sorts of different things. But the brain is not the biggest sex organ. That is a misconception, because it's actually your skin. But also, your brain is so connected to your sexual experiences.
Yes. So what you said there, with the skin,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that I think people overlook when they're thinking about the nervous system, they go exactly to the brain.
Yeah.
And the thing is, the brain is just a small portion of your nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, your entire behavior and everything that your brain does is primarily decided upon the sensory information coming up from your body to your brain. And so when you said your skin is the main, it's true, because literally everything that's coming up from your body to your brain is now deciding how you're going to behave and act.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it is something, I do some work in sensuality and helping people tap into all of that. And sensuality is literally the senses. It's literally when we can tap into our senses and really feel, what is that like when I caress my finger on my arm? What is that feeling? What is my temperature doing? What is that? Oh, that's a little bit scratchier. Why is it a little bit scratchier there? There's so much that we can dig into, but so often if we're doing something like that, it's just boop, done. I didn't even feel it. My skin is numb. Everything is numb.
Yes.
So yeah, it's
that's the numbness, the inability to notice your sensations is actually a stress and trauma response.
Yeah.
And so that's why so much of the work I do is all about helping people regulate their nervous system.
Yeah. And there's the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system.
Yeah.
So, I said that wrong.
No, it's okay. No, you said it the way everyone says it. So
yeah.
There's the sympathetic part and the parasympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system.
Boom. There it is. Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, do you want to talk about that a little bit in your work?
Okay. So, actually part of the reason I had developed the the language and everything I use now around the nervous system is because there's so much conflicting information all the time. Whether you're talking about stress, trauma, sex, orgasms, it doesn't matter. There's these little pieces of information that people would grab onto and run with it because they're like, oh, that sounds right. It came from a reliable source, or what I think is a reliable source, so that must be accurate. And a good example of this is the whole reptilian brain thing. And it's not accurate. It's like, it was just a framework that sounded pretty good, so people kept using it, but it's been debunked for decades. And yet people still latch onto this whole idea of this evolutionary components of the way our nervous system evolved. Like, we did not come from
no,
snakes.
It's not. And it's not about that. And it's like, it's the amygdala and your prefrontal cortex. Those are two different systems of your brain, like two different parts of the brain.
Yeah. So what I like to, I think, okay, let's back up a little bit here for me, at least.
I know we're getting into brain stuff.
Okay. So part of the issue is that the medical community comes from this very pathological framework where there is an origin for everything that happens. And so they want to look at the brain as these parts, and that's not the way the brain works. So you know how, like, if you go to pick up an item, people don't realize like how many different parts of the brain are being activated at the same time to pick up the item.
Yes.
And guess what? Some of those same parts are being activated to run away from a tiger. And the same, like, it just depends on what the situation is. So if we had to have a new part for every single function that we did, we would have like
it would be too big.
Like, exactly.
Our heads are big enough.
I kind of like to think of the brain parts as notes. Like, and when you play music, you play them in different, sometimes you play one's more pronounced than the other, and there's different variations. So there's like C flat and C minor, and kind of think of that as like levels of the C, right? Like levels of the prefrontal cortex involvement, right? And so it's hard though for people to switch from that, like, this does this, to an understanding of how all the musical notes fit together.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a lack of understanding that it is a whole system.
Yeah.
And based off of what you are experiencing, different parts of that system will be more prominent than other parts. That is such a beautiful little ringer.
I forgot to put my phone on Do Not Disturb.
It was so delightful, which is also, I feel like, a good opportunity to remind people that the alarms that go off impact your nervous system. Like, it's like, that is such like a lovely, smooth, it's like so pleasurable.
Yes.
And like, it can start as simply as that, as like the alarms that you choose to use and the notifications that you allow in and out of your space and stuff like that. So like, I like that as a as a point of like, see how beautiful that is, even though it's disruptive, like, it's totally fine. But yeah, just going back to systems, it's like, you're right. I think we want to simplify things so much to the point where we can say, oh, it's just your lizard brain, or it's just this, or it's just that, when it's just, actually, this is part of a whole. And based off of what is going on in the context of the situation and how emotionally heightened you are, yes, different systems are going to be taking the lead, but they are always working together because we are holistic beings, all of us. And the same thing with like sexuality versus everything in your life. Like, you can't shade the sexuality. You can't quiet the sexuality or hide that from a holistic health conversation. You know?
100%. Yeah. So, gosh, that I have to turn
Is it an alarm or?
Yeah, it's an alarm, and it's not going to go off until I turn it off.
I totally thought it was a ringer.
I'm like, this is what we choose to do with the situation.
I thought it was a ringer.
So in this moment, I'm going to choose to regulate my nervous system by turning off my alarm and putting it on.
Oh my God, because that's probably getting all up in your head a little bit.
It is.
This is what happens in real life, everyone. And I'm probably going to cut this part out, but maybe not, because I'm talking in your ears and maybe it sounds good. And perhaps I'm giving you a little bit of ASMR right now, which may also be regulating your nervous system because it sounds good and nice and warm. And a reminder that I love you.
Oh God, that was amazing. Aren't you guys all thankful that I had that little mishap or maybe intentional experience for pleasure.
Ooh, yeah. And that's okay, let's like play with that idea for a second, because I think we have the option as much as possible to choose whether to see something as a pleasurable experience or an aggravating experience. We can't control the things that happen around us. We can't control the fact that an alarm went off. Cool, thought it was not going to happen. It did happen. We can't control that, but we could control how we reacted to it and how we felt to it.
Yeah.
And felt about it. And we have that choice, not in every single situation, because some things are just too triggering and too traumatic, and that's completely fair, and no judgment there whatsoever, because there are things out of our control. But oftentimes when it's like an alarm or a person driving in front of you like a fucking asshole or whatever it is, we can choose to let that impact our nervous system or be like, you know what? It's fucking fine.
That actually kind of sums up the work I do.
I love that. Yes.
So, sometimes people come to me for different orgasm reasons.
Mhm.
That's usually why they're coming to me. They're like, well, if she'll talk about orgasms, will she also talk about this? And so they come to me with all kinds of different issues that are going on, wondering if this person can help them because they haven't been able to find help. And one of the things that is at the core of what I help people with is helping people to reframe.
Yeah.
And reframe the different experiences in their life. And it is those simple little things that you can choose to change your perspective that start giving you the practice to choose when things are more stressful.
Mhm.
Because it's physically impossible, well, maybe not impossible, but like nearly impossible to make a new choice when you're under stress.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Like biologically, like people don't realize this, like the path,
Yeah.
like it's energy intensive to create a new neural pathway.
Mhm.
And so for you to choose a new behavior, that's going to create a new neural pathway. And your brain's going to be like, nope, I'm using energy to deal with the stress. We are not creating any new neural pathways right now.
Mhm.
And so the only way you can have new behaviors in times of stress is to practice them when you're not stressed.
Yeah.
And that is where a pleasure practice really comes into play, because it's not even just about sexual pleasure, although that is the quickest way.
Yes. But sometimes you can't get there. Like sometimes there's so much other stuff in the way that you can't get to the sexuality stuff because of things outside of sensations,
Yeah. So yes, exactly. So it's about bringing in all these little moments of
Mhm.
pleasure and choosing to, react a different way.
Mhm.
And really, there's only two options when it comes to stress or just being in existence. You're either feeling safe or you're not.
Yeah.
And that's it. And it's not easy necessarily, but it's that simple. And once you start practicing learning how to be safe instead of choosing to think you're not safe,
Mhm.
when it's easier, you can start making those choices when it's really intense. And that is the process of regulating our nervous system.
Yeah.
It's about learning those skills. And this is actually something that's come up a lot, actually, in the work that I've been doing. It's about this idea of self-regulation.
Mhm.
And so I think it's also really important for people to realize that as a human animal, we did not evolve with self-regulation skills in place.
Yes.
We evolved in social settings. We had community around us, and you can kind of pick any time in history, and
Mhm.
whether you go back a little bit, and we had more of these, most of us found our community within our religions, but you
Mhm.
can go back to like tribal. I mean, like you can pick and choose.
It's everywhere.
It's everywhere.
The point is it's everywhere. We
everywhere.
were always in community.
Right.
Always. Always, always.
Whereas now we live in these situations where we have lots of neighbors, but not community.
Yeah.
And
Silos.
so we're not having those inherent built-in biological process of regulation
Mhm.
that you get when you're in community. And so this whole idea of self-regulation is a new skill.
Mm.
It's an emerging skill for humanity.
Yeah.
And so if someone who is watching or listening struggles with the idea that why can't I just regulate myself, just know that this is a new skill. Like
Yeah.
most of our parents did not know how to do this because
No.
they didn't need to, because
Mhm.
their grandparents didn't need to, and their grandparents didn't need to. So
Yeah.
it is this generation now that is learning or needing to understand how to self-regulate with no one showing them the way.
Well, not only that, it's also a lack of emotional intelligence. We've only been talking about emotional intelligence for the last couple of decades. So, and only really in the last maybe decade tops. So, all of these skills of self-regulation and understanding the experience of yourself and experiencing and understanding the experience of others and the body language and the nuances and all of this stuff, and recognizing even in yourself when you're in a heightened state, all of that is new. That is not anything that, like you said, our parents ever taught us. It's not anything that they ever learned. It's not anything that the vast majority of people in their like 70s and above are even capable of doing themselves, because they still haven't learned it. So between the community and a lack of emotional intelligence, it's a lot. It's a lot that we are all thankfully navigating. And then let's just pile on all the shame and everything involved with sexuality as a whole. So, like, it's very easy to understand why people struggle with this stuff in all, like, across the board.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought in shame and guilt. So
Mm-hmm.
this is another part, though there's different levels to the work I do. So I will always use the same language because I think it just makes it easier as I have different discussions. So there's 5 basic energy systems of the body. One's physical, one's emotional, one's mental, spiritual, and social.
Mm-hmm.
And so we know this actually on a scientific level, that they don't necessarily use these words in science. It's just, this is the words I use to encapsulate these different systems that we can document with science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It just makes it easier to have a conversation instead of saying this part of the brain with this network and this thing.
That's too much for anyone who is not into doing the research and is not coming into, like, if in a student setting, like sex ed setting, fine, but coming for help, no.
Exactly.
We got to simplify.
Exactly. So the physical energy system, that's really about that nervous system regulation. And then you brought up emotion. So there's a whole emotional energy system. And over here in Western, we have a different perception of what emotions mean than some other tribal communities. Their perception of emotions is so radically different. And they understand, I'm not saying all tribes do, and I'm not saying one's better or anything's worse. It's not about that. It's just where we come from in perspective. But there are documented cases of tribes reading people's emotional energy.
Oh yeah, healers. There are healers in tribes.
Yeah. And I have a son who has a brain injury, and so he doesn't have the ability to speak the way that you and I do. And so I have had to learn how to communicate with him very differently than, say, I have 2 sons. So I have an older son, neurotypical-ish, ADHD, so not exactly neurotypical, but compared to the younger one, neurotypical.
Yeah.
And so, I approach things the way that we're used to. But with my younger son, a lot of the skills and stuff that I learned and how I used to communicate didn't work with him. So I had to develop these whole different ways of communicating. And a lot of it was about trusting this emotional energy that I knew. Like I just stopped listening to whatever everyone should say about like parenting and stuff, and start really tapping into the emotional energy, because he can speak emotional energy.
Yeah.
And so that's how we communicate so much of what we do. And he's still trying to speak. So like he's using word approximation. So that's the emotional energy system. And then there's this mental energy system that we all know and experience of our mind. We all inherently know that our mind is separate from our body, which is also separate from our emotions. Like we have these emotional experiences, and then we think about our emotional experiences. So how they're separate, right? Like there's a separate part of our mind and our emotions and our physical body. And then there's that spiritual part too, where you have, I think, people who maybe struggle with like a crazy, quote unquote, crazy mind, but like their mind's just going like really fast.
Hyperactive.
They can really identify with this. You have that quick hyperactive mind, right? Which is that mental energy. But then there's sometimes when they're calmer and things are relaxed, when their nervous system is regulated, they're like, gosh, I was acting all crazy, or why was I even thinking that way? And that's like more of that spiritual energy system. And as I said, this is all based in biology. So I can actually go through the neuroscience and explain these systems. It's just well above most people's heads. So it's just a lot easier to explain it this way. And one of the thing about shame and guilt, so let's bring it back to that to understand this. So guilt is also social energy. That's how like we have this thing called social engagement system. We entrain my nervous system is entrained with yours right now. Like if there was the devices to do it, they'd be like
co-regulating.
Yeah,
exactly. Absolutely.
And so that's the social energy system. And so the guilt has to do with this break within the social energy system, because guilt usually means you feel bad about something you did that it affected the experiences of others.
Yeah.
But even more hard is shame. Yeah. Because shame at the end of it is a complete separation of that community and that social, like guilt just means that there's a wound in that energy system. Shame is a break in that energy system of the social system. And it is so impactful on our health and well-being. It is the most dysregulating feeling that anyone can have. And it is about, shifting through that. And now we're going to go into the sex part and right in sex education and this concept of sexuality that I see perpetuated, especially Western society. There are feelings and opinions about a physical process of someone's body. And when you are experiencing something that is inherent in your being, having high libido is actually a sign of well-being. It's on a pendulum. So if you have low libido, that's a sign that you're off kilter. And if you're obsessed with sex, that's also a sign that you're off kilter. But like a good, healthy libido where you want to have sex all the time, that's actually a sign of nervous system regulation.
I'm going to challenge that, because what about asexual people?
I know this is where I get a little bit of like pushback on it. And this is not about opinion on this perspective. I'm talking biology.
Yeah.
And so this is where it gets a little...
what the data has shown in people who are asexual and how much they've actually studied that.
So there isn't a lot of studies.
That's the problem, right?
It's hard to find studies at all on sexuality.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And when they are, by the way, it's all like college kids that are 18 to 25 or 22 or something like that, which are usually privileged, that are usually white, that are usually cis, hetero, all that. So there's a lot of problems in sex research.
So now what I will say with the asexual part, it doesn't surprise me because our society is kind of sick. There's a lot of pressures. There's a lot of things. And, I mean, also like the work that I do. So these people are coming to me, right? So I have people like, very high trauma or people who don't think of themselves as being traumatized, but they don't know why they don't function well. A lot of ADHD people come to me, people harmed by medical procedures.
Oh, yeah.
I have a whole bunch of these different little subsets. And the thing about low libido, and I don't actually address it. Like it's not like I'm avoiding it.
Yeah.
But what I have seen as people start regulating their nervous system, all of a sudden their libido comes back.
Yeah. Well, and that I do definitely 100,000% believe.
Right.
And I know for fact is true.
Right.
But I do think that we are making assumptions on the asexual community that are not necessarily true if we were to actually study people in the right way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I don't think that we would find that across every single person who identifies as asexual. I think there can be very, very healthy, regulated people who that's just not a part of what is for them. You know?
So everything is really nuanced too.
Yeah.
Right. And
absolutely.
And also think of science as a method. One of the things that I like to remind people, like if you're going to use science, you have to think of the bell curve, right? 80% of the people are going to fall underneath that bell curve.
Yes.
And that is what you're talking to. And there's always going to be outliers on every side. So just know that. Like I'm never excluding anything. You asked my opinion on the asexual part. So I would love to see this. I would love to see like proper good research that accounts for things. So this starts getting into shame and guilt too. And so one of the things that is hard about this whole thing too, because I've worked with people of all kinds of different things. They come to me for very specific reasons and I work with them on that specific reason. I'm not a a therapist. I'm not a
Yeah,
doctor,
yeah.
whatever. Like, I'm a coach. So my perspective as a coach is I don't care necessarily. I mean, when I say care,
Yeah, no.
I'm not saying I'm not caring.
Yeah. You care. You're not focused on.
Yeah, focused on. So I'm not focused on the why you're here. I'm
Yeah.
focused on the what do we do now?
Yeah. And also people are coming to you because they want to experience that. So that in and of itself means that they're not necessarily asexual because they are wanting to have that. So I think that's, the
interesting part
sometimes, I don't know.
Because sometimes they're in relationships with people where are not asexual. And so they want to see if there's something they can do to do this for their partner.
Yeah.
Right? Like a lot of times it's not for them, but they're just trying to say like, oh,
I want to be able to do this for my partner.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that definitely happens.
Yeah. So it's, I don't have a huge subset of asexual people. It is true.
Yeah.
Right. I do have a lot of people who used to feel sexual and used to want to be intimate and have these different experiences. And now they don't, and they want to get back to that.
Totally.
And this is, it's hard, right? Like, because the research isn't there. So going back to the shame part, because I want to bring this in because it's all tied to this.
Yeah.
So shame is this like full separation where something is wrong with you. And when the thing that's wrong with you is a part of your body and your being.
When it's intrinsic to you as a human.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There is no other message that comes across. Maybe it's not these words. Maybe it's not even conscious. Maybe it's subconscious, is that you're broken.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And people say that all the time.
Yeah. And so that is kind of at the crux of so much of the work, and all the people that are out here, like, trying to talk about sex education and trying to get people aware of the things that are experiencing in their body. And I also do think there's levels. I've watched now working with people at all kinds of different levels. I don't do, certain practices with people who are over here and people are over here. I don't do,
Yeah. I mean, that's the boundaries of coaching versus therapy versus counseling, like all of them versus educating, like all of these different modalities have different limitations of what you can actually do with a client and how you can actually serve that person. So that's just like a blanket for everyone to understand that educators can only do so much and coaches can only do so much and therapists can only do so much. There's like, it's when you're working with an ethical person, they know where their boundaries are, and it does have to be really clear. So that's worth saying as you explore the world of healing.
Exactly. I've referred many people to therapists, like different kinds of therapy. So
it's your team, right?
Yeah,
like it's the whole team.
I kind of look at part of my job as knowing what all the different therapies are. So that way, when someone comes up, I'm like, oh no, go over here with this. Right. And then come back to me.
Yeah, exactly.
And then
we can work hand in hand,
exactly.
but this is something that you need to, a therapist is qualified to work with you on. And this is something that I can work with you on, because also therapists can't do coaching and they can't do the same thing that a coach would in terms of action plans and moving things forward and trying things out and testing and talking and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
They have their boundaries and we have our boundaries.
Yeah.
So it is, they are very separate worlds.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, from the coaching and therapists. So I actually have a lot of therapists and doctors as clients.
Yeah.
And it's real, and coaches too. It's really interesting hearing, I get the other side of that experience, right? Like them as people. And the therapist framework comes from this very like guarded, like I'm going to be the authority and, here's how we're going to approach this.
There's no sharing. I can't offer you anything.
Right.
It's very like very boundaried.
Right. And it's interesting too, like as I could see benefits and I know why it's there.
Sure.
And I'm never saying no to anything. There's always a place and a time for it. But there's also this like shame perspective that kind of gets perpetuated in a little bit in some of these therapies, because there's still this level of like, you're here to fix me, versus stepping into the ownership of your body and you being able to choose a different experience through life.
Yeah, it's a complicated relationship. And I think that there are definitely therapists that struggle through that to figure out, yes, I know what my professional and ethical boundaries are, but how can I add more humanity to my clients' sessions? And how can I maybe offer a little bit more of myself in a way that's not going to break those boundaries and that's going to respect the relationship that's at hand, but also humanize their experience.
Yes.
So it's challenging. That is the reason why I don't want to be a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
I thought about being a therapist, and I even went for my second certification. I went for counseling for a while, and then I recently realized like I don't want to have those types of boundaries. I'm already certified as a coach. I'm certified as an educator. I want to keep down that path because for me, it's more, first of all, obviously about like mass communication and bigger audiences and just like making things accessible in that way, in an entertaining way. But I didn't want to, like, I didn't want to be in a room with someone and not be able to share the experience, especially if I'm with like a non-monogamous person. Like that's a very powerful thing to be able to share an experience in a way that does not center you, but helps them feel seen and understood.
Yep. It's such a huge piece that I think is overlooked a lot. And I will say I have a very big overlap of people who have know that they have trauma. They've had trauma and they can feel that their past is holding them back, and ADHD.
Yeah.
And it's really in this kind of cross between the trauma and the ADHD is often not served because if you go to ADHD, they approach it this way. And if you go to trauma, they approach it this way without understanding how they intersect. And so there's so much of that. I'm broken, I'm broken, I'm broken, I'm broken. That is very difficult for people to like, tackle and grasp.
Yeah.
And then when they talk to someone that's like, oh yeah, I like ever have this thought and this and this, and they're like, oh, you too?
Yeah.
Oh my God. Okay. Right. And you can't, like, as an educator, you can only talk about so many things and you can't address all the little nuances. But when you're working with someone, it's brought up, you're able to share that.
Yeah.
Right. They may not have found this somewhere else yet on social media. You don't necessarily have a resource, right, to be able to point them to, versus a shared experience that you can talk and explore and then decide how to help them, based off of their feedback. Right.
Yeah. That real-time acknowledgement.
Yeah. It's super powerful. And that helps a lot with that shame part.
Yeah.
It helps with that, oh, I'm not broken.
Yeah, because, taking shame back into the being outed of the community, because essentially, again, like that's what it is. It's like the community is here and now I'm not a part of it because of this thing that I did or felt or whatever it is. Now you're on this island by yourself, but now you see one more person there.
Yep.
And now you see another person and another person. And all of a sudden, this shame island is actually just a new community of people. And that's such a powerful tool to get us out of that shame cycle and just seeing the others around us that have those experiences, especially when it comes to sexual dysfunction, sexual desires, sexual, behaviors, all of that stuff. Because again, all of it is in the shadows. When I talk about intimacy coordinating, I started calling myself like a gaffer of sex scenes because it's like, I'm here to light it. I'm here to light the scene. Like, I want to put light on everything. We're going to blast the light and then we'll shape it around, So it's kind of the same thing with shame. It's like the more we can shed light on all of these things that not everyone, but like so many people are experiencing, the less we're alone on that island.
Yep, exactly. There's so much, people don't realize how much people think the same way.
Yeah.
So I'm open when I go to places. I'm like, yeah, I'm an orgasm and neuro pleasure coach. And I cannot count the amount of people that have like got, pull me aside in the kitchen or in line at the bathroom or, wherever it was. They're like, hey, I just wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, stand in line. Like you're the, you're the 127th person now to say this. Ask me if you're not, weird or am I abnormal or normal or whatever. It's just all this confusion because no one talks about it. And unfortunately, the community ethics of sexuality research and the whole implications of overstepping boundaries and, you have some well-meaning scientists that want to do the work, but then they are beholden to the people that give them the money so they can do the work. And the people who give them the money are beholden to the people who purchase the things or do the things that help them get the money.
Or pass the laws.
Yes.
It's all, once again, it's the systems.
Yeah.
Everything is a system. And the more we can understand that literally every single thing around us is a system, and at any given time, different parts of that system will be the ones in control, the more I think we can navigate the world around us and understanding how interconnected everything is.
Yes.
Ourselves, the schools that we go to, the research that we do, this computer, this phone, like this is all a system. Everything is a system. So, it's, can I shift the focus of which part of the system is in control? Like sometimes I can. That's going back to the pleasure thing, right?
Yeah.
Like our brain is like, which I think it's also worth noting that our brains are kind of hardwired for the bad things because of survival. So there's like an aspect to it that like used to be for safety, but we don't live in that type of environment where our brain has to be hyper aware of all the things that could be bad. We can choose to shift that.
Yeah, yes, and
yes, of course, yeah.
Okay.
You're deeper in the neuro stuff than I am, but
I'm
going to
yes and this because it's with a lot of things, it's like, yes, that's true, and this is also true.
Yes.
So yes, that's the way our system is wired, and it's also wired for pleasure.
Yeah.
And so that is, people kind of focus on this fact that this pain aspect, and we're always learning ways to mitigate pain, but by trying to mitigate pain, we're still focused on the pain.
Mm-hmm.
And we have lost a lot of the pleasure activities of life through this lack of community, through this new shift in the way that we live in the world.
Lack of play.
Right. All kinds of things. So that we notice what's wrong and we want to fix what's wrong. So that's this pathological way of thinking. Once again, like we're going to go back to like, there must be this thing.
Fix it. You don't have to fix it. Yeah.
Right. It's like, no, that just is.
Yeah.
Like, it's a beautiful thing that we get stressed. Like, all growth happens because of stress. Stress is not a bad thing. Stress, like our bodies are designed to be stressed, and we grow more and we learn more and we like evolve more under stress. But it has to be balanced with that pleasure.
Yeah.
And that is where the well-being part comes in. And I like to kind of, we were talking about sympathetic and parasympathetic. So this is a concept I play around with all the time too. So you can think of, you're either safe or not safe, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're not safe, that's stress, sympathetic. And when you're safe, it's parasympathetic, and you're safe. And think of it as a breath. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. When you breathe in, it is part of the sympathetic nervous system.
Yeah.
When you breathe out, it's part of the parasympathetic nervous system. So life is not about always focusing on the breath in, because it's like you're holding your breath.
Then you can't.
All the time.
Yeah.
It is how you create health and well-being within your body, is that balance between the in-breath and the out-breath.
The flow.
And so, helping people learn how to bring more pleasure into their life is part of that. Like, it is a health and well-being practice. Mm-hmm. As I said, sexuality, sensuality is the quickest way because of what we talked about at the very beginning with the senses and the sensuality part, right? So the more you can activate your senses and bring as many senses into your awareness, what you're actually doing is sending signals that you're safe. Mm-hmm. And so you can't be aware of the sensations in your body when you're unsafe, unless it's important for the stress response at that moment. So let's take the classic example of running away from a tiger. Mm-hmm. If you're running away from a tiger, you should not be noticing if the air is gently caressing the back of your, like, you're not designed
impossible.
That way. Right?
You can't do both.
It's not, we're not designed that way, and rightfully so. We want to use as much energetic resources to get away from the tiger.
Exactly. Yeah.
But we need to go back once we are safe, like actually physically safe, start developing those practices to remind us how to get back into our body. And somatic experiences and practices are a key foundational, component of any pleasure practice. The reason why I like going toward sexual, sensual, practices is because of the nerve pathways and the way that, if you think about your sex organs, they are deactivated under times of stress because you do not need to think about having sex while you're running away from a tiger.
100%.
AKA libido.
Yeah.
Right. So it is a biological process that can only happen when you're not stressed. So, or the only time it should happen is when you're not stressed.
Well,
right?
because again, your energy has to go into what that stressor is and
Exactly.
solving that problem.
Exactly.
Versus, engaging in the pleasure and
Right.
and ultimately, whether you're using it for procreation or not, procreation, because
Right.
that's again a system in your body.
Well, actually, I'm going to that's another one of those things where there's this whole belief that our sexual organs are for procreation. No, that is just a component of it.
No. It's
Right.
a part of it, but you can't, part of the reason why people are unable to get pregnant when they're so stressed is because your body is not going to allow you. So that's what I mean is that when you're in that stress response, the systems in your body are like, not the time for that. So we're not going to let that happen. So that's why so often we see people struggling. And then they're like, okay, we're just going to go on vacation, and then they get pregnant, or they adopt a child and then they get pregnant. This doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen often. And part of that is because of everything that you're saying with the system being like, now is not the time. We got to shut it down.
Exactly. And this kind of brings back to the sex education part. So there's such a disservice in the way our sex education is laid out. We really learn reproductive education. We don't. I know. Like if you're lucky, you learn.
We do. Yeah.
But even the way that we're taught to think about our sexuality comes from this reproductive framework. And it is not biologically the purpose of your sexuality. So remember that whole social energy system?
Yeah.
The entrainment, like the co-regulation that you get when you're with two or more people in those safe settings where you're bringing on all of your senses is the quickest way to get your nervous system regulated.
Yeah.
Because by bringing awareness and attention to these parts that are turned off while you're stressed, the only way to get attention to them is during safety.
Yeah.
And so you start sending signals to your body that you're safe. Doing this isn't quite as effective as touching your genitals.
Yeah.
It isn't, like on a perceptual level. Like you can still have sensation on your arm when you're not safe.
Yeah,
depending on the situation. So it is it's really important to think about that sympathetic and parasympathetic. So when you're in that really, really stressed state, and if it continues, people know about the flight, flight, or flight. Yeah. So I actually start with flight. Freeze. So flight is actually first. And so it's flight, fight, freeze, and flop. And I know some people say fawn, but I'll kind of say
flop is what you call it?
I call it flop.
Okay.
Fawn. And there's 6 stress responses. Yeah. There's flight, fight, freeze, and flop. Those are related to the neurobiology of it and on the vagus nerve. The friend and the fawn response are tied to when those only happen when the stressor is a human or a mammal, a social engagement system. So the friend and fawn response are truly social engagement system combination with the stress response.
Yeah.
And so that flight, fight, freeze, and flop, those are related specifically to the vagus nerve in the autonomic nervous system. So the flight and fight are in that sympathetic nervous system part that we were talking about. And so that is the inhale breath, right?
Yeah.
And the exhale breath of the parasympathetic, there's a cutoff point, and people may not realize it. It's the lower part of the diaphragm. So everything above the diaphragm is part of your sympathetic nervous system. Everything below is part of your parasympathetic. So if you want to get people quickly to be able to regulate their nervous system, you need to focus on areas that are part of that parasympathetic area of the autonomic nervous system. And this is why breath work sometimes is confusing for people. Sometimes it works for them and sometimes it doesn't. And it's because sometimes the breath work stays in that sympathetic area and doesn't actually go all the way down to parasympathetic. So they're just staying in that flight or fight response, and they're not actually creating that full breath, inhale and exhale breath that is required to bring that parasympathetic back online.
Yeah. That makes so much sense. I want to shift gears for a second.
Okay.
Where did you grow up?
Where did I grow up? So define the word grow up. Because I would say I'm still not grown up.
Well, yeah, true. Where did you receive your formative sex education? The baby formative, the not where you are now,
Okay.
but
So I lived in multiple places. So my mom died when I was 14. So prior to 14, I grew up in North Hollywood, California. And then when my mom died, I moved to a couple different aunts and uncles. And so one was also in California, but like Santa Clarita. And then I went to Maryland. Then I did a little stint on the East Coast and went to college over there for a little bit and then came back over to LA. So I don't know where growing up
it's
counts.
all over. It's all over. And for many people, that is what the story is. It's all over.
Yeah.
What do you remember from your earliest sex education experiences?
Oh, so that would be in elementary school. So I did go to a private elementary school.
Okay.
And so we actually got sex education. It was a Lutheran school. So
okay.
It was a sex education from a Lutheran school. And basically it told us don't have sex because you will get a disease and die.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that
sounds about right.
That was like my first experience of it. I do think I got it again my sophomore year of high school, but that was at a Catholic high school.
Yeah.
And that once again was don't have sex because you will get a disease and die.
Yeah.
But I think I remember learning some of the body parts, right? But that actually takes me into why I became an orgasm coach.
Yeah.
So in 2017, I separated from my husband and decided to go on a sexual journey from all these fantasies I'd had before. I'm like, I'm not getting any younger. I'm free and I have less judgment about myself to go and do the things. So I'm just going to do it. Like, I'm just going to plug my nose and jump into the deep end and figure out if I can swim.
Hell
right.
Yeah.
And I started on this journey. So I started following people that were like sex educators and stuff and doing all kinds of fun things in my life. And within about a month of each other, I had two experiences that kind of shifted my trajectory. One was that I had a threesome with this couple and they were saying something about squirting. And I was like, what's that? I I remember some guy telling me about that when I was in my 20s. Right?
Yeah.
Because he asked me if it was a squirter. I was like, what?
What's that?
And then she goes, you've never squirted? I'm like, no. And she goes, honey, make her squirt. And then he did. And I was like, what? What did my body just do? And how do I get it to do that again?
Yeah.
And so that was the kind of the beginning, the catalyst to this, and what kind of solidified my wanting to be more of a coach and telling people about this is like, I started trying to figure this out. Like, how did he make me squirt? And I could not find the science. I was like,
oh yeah.
I'm like, wait, there's no, how
is there no science
like
on
this? This is a biomechanical process that happened in my body.
Yeah.
Like, why is this not, like, someone had to have done this research. Like, that was like my logic.
You would think.
Right. Yeah. And that was when I was like, oh, the sex education I got was flawed. And then I saw a picture, someone put a diagram of a full clitoris, and I was like, what? I'm like, it's not just a little button.
It's
I'm like,
that.
What else don't I know? Like, so between those two,
clitoris. You keep talking.
So between those two things, I was like, there's so much I don't know about my body. And yes, this.
Hello.
And so that's actually how I decided to do this. Because I started researching because I was like, what else don't I know? Like, what else wasn't I told?
Yeah.
And it was this realization that well-meaning doctors don't know everything.
Oh yeah, they're literally not trained in sexuality.
Yeah.
Your gynecologist is not trained in sexuality. Your urologist is not trained in sexuality.
Yeah.
None of them are.
Exactly.
Not unless they went out and they sought it on their own, which many of them do. Many of them absolutely do.
Yes.
The vast majority do not.
Right. And I had my own personal experience with my gynecologist in a situation. So several years ago, I had gotten an HPV diagnosis, and it was like the cervical dysplasia that's like before cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And because I'm a little bit older, they were like, you have to have a leap. There's no way you're going to, it's not going to clear on its own. And statistically, people over a certain age, they don't clear the virus. So younger people do clear the virus more, but the leap is this procedure where they use it basically an electric knife, but it's like, and they kind of carve out the parts of the cells that are developing into, or might develop into cancer.
Yeah.
And then you go on with your day, so to speak.
As if nothing happened.
Right. And I knew, because they had the online system. So I already got my test results. I already knew how to read my test results. I'm like, okay, I know what they're going to suggest. And I actually was all ready to do the leap, because I was like, okay, I know what the leap is. The statistically, okay, it's safe. It's all, all the things.
Probably.
I did the research. And the night before I was going into the doctor's office, some random woman reached out to me and she's like, hey, have you ever worked with someone who hasn't been able to orgasm after a leap? And I was like, wait, what? I'm just now beginning to explore my sexuality.
Yeah.
Like, that is
can't
not
happen.
Like, that's not a risk I'm willing to take right now. Like, you mean there's a possibility that I won't have an orgasm? I was like, no, everything says it's safe. And then I started digging in.
What does safe actually mean?
Exactly. So safe from the allopathic perspective is staying alive.
Exactly.
It does
but
not,
what kind of life?
Right. That is a different thing.
Yeah.
They have a very,
it's a narrow view.
Yeah. They have that pathological, like, this is the problem, so this is the solution.
Exactly.
Kind of situation. Yeah. And
pleasure is absolutely not a part of that.
Right. And so I talked to her a little bit about, like, what were her symptoms and, her different things, because I wanted to see if I could help her, which I have.
Yay.
But I was like, oh, and so that got me into a whole different understanding. So at that point, I was actually just orgasm, like, let me teach you the techniques.
Yeah.
And it was actually because of that one random phone call from this woman the day before I was supposed to have a leap, that I was like, wait, let me understand a little bit more. And I already knew enough about the nervous system and some of the way things worked at that point. And then really started understanding the impact of trauma, because whether the trauma is physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, social, it actually doesn't matter. All goes through the same part of the brain. It's the periaqueductal gray. It's all perceived through the same place, and it creates some of the same symptoms, regardless of how that pain is incurred through your physical well-being. You're human. You're human
human being.
Right.
The whole container, all of it.
Exactly. And so that whole thing. So when I went to go talk to my doctor, I'm like, I'm not ready to do the leap yet. I just got this information. I need more research. And when we were talking about it, so the woman who called me, she had just started learning how to do cervical orgasms. Like, she had kind of happened across Kim and Mommy. Do you know who I'm talking about?
No, I don't think so.
She's got some really good education out there.
Yeah.
And so she had done that, and her and her husband had started having this amazing sex, and then she had the leap, and then she hadn't been able to have a cervical orgasm since. And I was like, oh, and I had already just recently, and I was like, oh shit, didn't even think about that. Yeah, they're good. Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah. It was this whole process of like, oh my gosh, wait, before you go do this procedure, make sure you know, because that's just the way my brain works. And when I talked to my gynecologist, she wrote on the notes that client says that the leap could cause an impact on a clitoral orgasm. And I was like, no, that's not what I said. I said a cervical orgasm. And like later, because I had the follow-up, I was like, I just want to make sure, like, you got that right. She's like, no, clitoral orgasm. I'm like, no. Cervical orgasm. She goes, you can't orgasm through the cervix. There's
honey,
not nerve.
Yes,
they're like, it's numb. And I was like, okay.
Oh boy.
Okay,
like,
so I literally had to
educate.
I literally had to educate my gynecologist on the 6 pair endings of the cervix. I mean, the cervix. I'm making sure I'm saying the right words now.
Yeah.
And she was like, wait, what?
Yes.
She's like, where is this? I'm like, it's still not in the medical book.
Yeah.
So I'm like,
and it's not going to be unless the more we push for it, it eventually will be. But
yeah. And so By the way, urologists have a little bit more of this information.
A little bit more.
Just a little bit more. They have more of the clitoris. They have more because of the bladder being attached to the vagus nerve.
Yes.
And that is the reason why.
And also because they're culturally speaking, we are more concerned with men being able to have sex after prostate cancer versus women having, or people with penises having sex after prostate cancer versus people with vulvas having any sort of pleasure with sex, full stop.
Yeah.
That's just, historically speaking, culturally speaking, that is not every urologist. People do care, but generally speaking, we put more care into people with penises and their sexual pleasure than people with vulvas.
Right.
So that's why that they're going to know a little bit more in those areas.
Exactly. Because the urologist is like,
you got to be able to fuck again.
No, actually the urologist,
no, I know,
like, because it's the bladder, like that's their thing. Like you should be able to pee.
Yeah.
And they don't, if you're male or female, they still want you to be able to pee.
Yeah.
And they understand the importance of sensation to be able to
hold it
manage.
and,
exactly.
Do
so
all the
they
things.
don't overlook the nerves when they're dealing with urology because they know how important the nerves are.
Yeah.
Whereas
and the senses and all of it, the control. Yeah.
Whereas with the cervix, there was this, flawed information in the 60s from Johnson & Johnson that made the whole, textbooks from that point forward, basically they made doctors think that the cervix is numb and doesn't have sensation. And it's absolutely not true. It does get numb when it's traumatized.
Yes.
But it can awaken. And so you can have like a cervical awakening experience, even if you've had experiences, whatever they were that caused the numbing. So it can't, and it doesn't always have to be that big T trauma that people think of. Little repeated stresses.
It adds up.
It adds up. Like your body doesn't care where it comes from. It's just like, hey, we've got a problem here.
This is what we're going to do to solve it.
Yeah.
So at this point in the show, if it's a comedian, I will give them a pop quiz, but I don't do that with my sexperts because what is that good for? So what is one thing that you would like to leave people with?
That the quickest way to heal is through pleasure.
Yes.
It's biological.
Yeah.
Remember that whole safe, not safe part? So when you focus on pleasure, you're focused on safety. And so every time you focus on pleasure, you're reminding your body that it can be safe, and it's causing your body to get into self-regulation, even if no one else is around.
Yay. I love that.
Yeah.
Where can people find you?
I'm at Owning Your O, pretty much everywhere. OwningYourO.com. Instagram, Owning Your O, Facebook, Owning Your O, everywhere.
We love good branding. Solid across the board, Owning Your O. Thank you so much for being on the show. I could talk to you for hours, and I'm definitely going to keep talking to you when we hang up here. But no, it was so nice to meet you at the event and just get to know you as a human a little bit. It was so good to get to dig deeper into the work that you do. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah. If you like this show, please leave a 5-star review. Give me stellar ratings. Share this with a friend, especially someone who doesn't know about cervix orgasms. Let's teach them something. But yeah, share this with someone who you think is going to be, who's going to like it. Share it with a partner. This is a great way to start conversations, is to share a podcast between each other and then have a little chat back later. But thank you so much for listening and watching and all the things. And